Okay, so before I start I just need to take a deep breath because even thinking about this night still makes my heart race and my hands get a little shaky, and I know that sounds dramatic, but trust me, by the end of this you are going to completely understand why. And if you are someone who has ever felt like you were living two completely different lives at the same time, then this story is going to hit you somewhere really deep, so please just stay with me, okay? Just stay with me until the very last word, because I promise it is worth it. So let me set the scene. It is junior year, almost senior year, the kind of time in high school where everything feels like it actually matters for the first time, like the grades matter, the friends matter, the parties matter, and prom matters more than anything else. And I had been the kind of guy who kind of just floated through high school without making too many waves. I played some basketball, I had decent grades, I had a good group of friends, and on the outside I looked like any other 17-year-old kid who was just trying to figure things out, and nobody had any idea what was going on inside my head. And I want to be really honest with you right now because that is the whole point of this, so here it goes. Ever since I was maybe 11 or 12 I had this feeling that I could never quite explain, where I would look at certain clothes and feel something that I could not put into words. It was not anything weird, it was just this deep aching pull, like something inside me recognized something that the rest of the world was telling me was not for me, and for years I pushed it way down. I told myself it was just a phase, I told myself it was nothing, I told myself lots of things that were not true. But there was one thing I never told anybody, and that was the secret I had been keeping since 8th grade, which was that sometimes when I was alone I would try on my older sister Maya's clothes, not in any strange way, just in this quiet, desperate way, like I was trying to understand something about myself that I did not have the language for yet, and every single time I did it I felt this rush of something that was so close to being myself that it scared me more than anything else in the world. Because feeling like yourself should not be scary, right? It should not be the most terrifying thing you have ever felt. Okay, so fast forward to March of junior year, and prom is coming and everyone is losing their minds about it, and my best friend since 5th grade, Danny, who is one of those people who has never once cared what anyone thinks about anything, comes up to me one day at lunch and he says, "Hey, I have an idea for prom," and the way he said it I already knew it was going to be something completely unexpected, because Danny's ideas always were, and he slides his phone across the table and on the screen there is this image of two guys at a different school's prom, and one of them is wearing this absolutely stunning ball gown and the other one is in a classic tux, and they looked incredible. And I remember just staring at that picture and feeling my heart do this complicated thing where it jumped and sank and flew all at the same time. And Danny goes, "What if we went to prom like that? What if I wore the tux and you wore the dress?" And we just completely owned it, and I remember laughing it off instantly, like immediately reflexively laughing the way you do when something gets too close to a nerve you have been protecting for years. And I said something like, "Yeah right man, very funny," and changed the subject, and Danny let it go, but he gave me this look, this very specific Danny look that meant this conversation is not over. And it was not over because 2 days later he brought it up again, but this time he said something that unlocked something in me. He said, "Listen, I am not trying to be funny, I have seen the way you look at certain things, and I think this could be something really meaningful for you, and you do not have to do anything you do not want to do, but I just want you to know that if you wanted to I would be right there with you, and nobody would mess with us because I would not let them." And I remember sitting in my car after school that day, just gripping the steering wheel and staring at nothing, and feeling for the first time in my life like someone might actually see me, and that was honestly the most overwhelming feeling I had ever had up to that point, because I had spent so many years making absolutely sure that nobody could see me. So I went home and I did not sleep that night, and I mean I literally did not sleep. I just lay there in the dark thinking about that image on Danny's phone, thinking about the way those two guys looked so free and so confident and so completely unbothered by the world, and I thought about every single time I had felt even a tiny piece of that feeling alone in my room, and I thought about what it would mean to feel that in public in front of my entire school, and my whole body was simultaneously screaming yes and absolutely not. The next week was the hardest week of my entire life up to that point, because I had made a decision that I could not unmake once I said it out loud, and the decision was this: I was going to tell Danny yes, and I was terrified. I found him after 3rd period, and I pulled him aside into this little alcove by the water fountains, and I said okay, and he looked at me and said, "Okay, what?" And I said, "Okay, I want to do it," and his whole face changed into this enormous grin, and he grabbed my shoulder and said, "I knew it," and I said, "Nobody can know yet," and he said, "Obviously," and that was it. That was the moment my entire life quietly shifted direction. Now here is where it gets really complicated, because saying yes to Danny was one thing, but the actual reality of what that meant was a completely different mountain to climb, because first of all I needed a dress, and I had no idea how to shop for one, especially not as a teenage boy who had never acknowledged this part of himself to anyone ever, and second of all there was my family, and specifically there was my mom, who I loved more than anything and who I had absolutely no idea how she would react, and third of all there was Maya, my older sister, who was now in her first year of college and who would be home for spring break in about 2 weeks, and whose entire wardrobe I had been secretly borrowing for the past 3 years. I decided to start with Maya, and I want to tell you that the conversation I had with her when she came home for spring break was the second most scared I have ever been in my entire life, and I will tell you what was the first in a little while. Just keep listening. I waited until the second night she was home and our parents had gone to sleep, and I knocked on her bedroom door and she said come in, and she was sitting on her bed doing homework, and she looked up and she could tell immediately that something was wrong, because Maya has always been able to read me better than anyone, and she put her pen down and she said what is it, and I sat on the edge of her bed and I opened my mouth and nothing came out for like a full 30 seconds, and she just waited, and finally I said I have something to tell you, and she said I know, and I said you know what, and she said I have known for a while and I want you to tell me in your own words whenever you are ready, and I looked at my sister and I just completely fell apart. I told her everything. I told her about the clothes, I told her about the way I felt, I told her about Danny's idea, I told her about the image on the phone, I told her about every single night I had spent trying to figure out who I was, and she listened to every single word, and when I was done she hugged me for so long and so hard, and she said you are so brave, and I said I have not done anything brave yet, and she said you just did. Maya was incredible. She did not make it weird, she did not catastrophize, she did not ask a million questions I was not ready to answer. She just said how can I help, and I said I think I need a dress, and she laughed this beautiful laugh and said well it is a very good thing that I have excellent taste. We spent the next 3 days in secret, basically going through her wardrobe and also making 2 very careful trips to some consignment shops a couple towns over where nobody knew us, and I want to tell you something about those 3 days. They were some of the most purely joyful days of my young life, and also some of the most confusing, because with every dress I tried on I felt more like myself and also more like I was standing on the edge of something enormous and irreversible, and the two feelings were completely inseparable from each other. We found it on the 3rd day. It was at a small vintage shop, and it was this deep midnight blue floor-length gown with a simple silhouette and these tiny silver details along the neckline, and when I put it on and looked in the dressing room mirror something happened that I cannot fully describe even now. It was like watching 2 versions of yourself merge into one. It was like a breath you had been holding for 7 years finally releasing, and Maya was standing behind me, and she had her hand over her mouth and her eyes were wet, and she whispered that is it, and I said yeah, and neither of us said anything else for a while. Now here is the part one had been dreading the most, telling my mom, and I kept putting it off, and prom was getting closer and Maya kept gently pushing me, and I kept saying soon soon soon, and then one Sunday morning about 3 weeks before prom I came downstairs and my mom was in the kitchen making coffee, and she looked up and she said you look like you have something on your mind, and I thought well here we go. I sat down at the kitchen table and I said Mom I need to tell you about prom, and she said okay, and I said it might not be what you are expecting, and she said honey I have been your mother for 17 years, very little you could tell me would shock me, and I said I'm going to wear a dress to prom, and the kitchen was completely silent for what felt like about 45 years but was probably about 6 seconds, and then my mom put down her coffee mug and she looked at me and she said are you happy about this? And I said yes I think so, and she said is it going to be a beautiful dress? And I said Maya helped me pick it out, and my mother's face did this incredibly complicated thing and she stood up and walked around the table and hugged me and said then I cannot wait to see you in it, and I cried right there in the kitchen like a complete mess, and she held me and rubbed my back and she said I love you exactly as you are, do you understand me? And I said yes, and she said good, now tell me everything. I will never forget that morning for as long as I live. Okay, so now we are about 10 days out from prom and things are going as well as they can be going. Maya has helped me figure out hair and makeup in the most low-key way possible, nothing over the top, just enough to feel complete. Danny has his tux sorted, and he is acting like this is the most normal thing in the world, which is exactly the energy I needed, and my mom has been nothing short of amazing, checking in on me every day, making sure I am okay and not overwhelmed, and I am feeling something close to ready, and then the thing happens that I absolutely did not see coming. Danny's mom runs into my mom at the grocery store. I want you to understand that our two moms have known each other for 12 years. They are friendly, they talk, they occasionally have coffee, and somehow in this conversation Danny's mom mentions prom, and somehow the detail about what we are wearing comes up, and I do not know exactly what was said, but what I do know is that by the end of that conversation Danny's mom called Danny, who called me immediately and said we have a problem. Turns out Danny's mom was not nearly as cool about this as my mom was, and Danny was on the phone with me while simultaneously being yelled at in the background, and he was trying to stay calm, but I could hear the stress in his voice, and he said my mom is saying this is embarrassing and she does not want people talking, and I felt this cold wave of guilt wash over me because I had pulled my best friend into my story and now it was causing problems in his family, and that was the last thing I had ever wanted. I told Danny that we did not have to do it, that it was okay, that I understood, and Danny said stop it, and I said no really it is fine, and Danny said I said stop it, and then he said something to his mom that I could not quite hear, and there was a long pause, and then he came back on the phone and said I will handle my mom, you just focus on being ready, and I said Danny, and he said what, and I said thank you, and he said obviously. Over the next several days Danny had what I can only imagine were some very difficult conversations at home, and I felt guilty about every single one of them, and I offered to bail out at least 4 more times, and every single time Danny refused, and I later found out that what Danny had said to his mom in that moment on the phone was that he had known me for most of his life and that I was one of the best people he had ever met, and that if she wanted to miss prom she was welcome to do that, but that he was going, and he was going with me, and that was final. And when he told me that, I honestly did not have words. Prom night arrived, and I am going to try to describe what that felt like as accurately as I can, because I want you to understand what was happening inside me. It was not excitement, it was not nervousness, it was this total full-body awareness, like every single nerve ending was awake at the same time, and the world was both incredibly sharp and incredibly surreal, and I was standing in Maya's old room wearing that midnight blue dress with my hair done and just the softest, most natural makeup, and I looked in the mirror and I saw something I had never seen before, which was just me, just completely and fully me, and it was the most terrifying and wonderful thing I had ever experienced. My mom came in and she stopped in the doorway and her hand went to her heart and she said, "Oh honey," and her voice broke, and I said, "Do not make me cry, I will ruin my makeup," and she laughed and wiped her eyes and said, "You are so beautiful," and I believed her. Danny picked me up, and when I walked out to the car he looked at me and he just nodded slowly and said yeah, and I said yeah, and he said let us go, and we went. Now here is the part where I need to tell you about the first most scared I have ever been in my life, because it was not telling Maya and it was not telling my mom, it was walking through the doors of the prom venue with Danny by my side, and I want to describe what happened in that moment as honestly as I can. There were people everywhere, and there was music and lights, and everyone was in their gowns and their tuxes, and for one terrible second as we walked through those doors I felt the entire world snap into focus, and I was standing there in a dress at my high school prom, and every single fear I had ever had about being seen rushed up at me all at once, and my hand grabbed Danny's arm and he leaned over and said, "I have got you," and we walked in. The first few minutes were the longest minutes of my life. I could feel people looking, and I could not tell if the looks were good or bad or confused, or all three, and my heart was hammering so hard I was sure people could see it through the dress, and then something happened that I did not expect. A girl from my English class named Sophia came up to me and she looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Oh my God, you look amazing," and I said thank you, and she said, "No seriously, that dress is stunning, where did you get it?" And I told her about the vintage shop and she wanted the address, and she pulled her friend over and her friend said, "You look incredible," and suddenly there were 4 people around me talking about the dress and talking to me, not at me, not about me, and I realized I was talking back and I was smiling and the hammering in my chest was getting quieter. Not everyone was kind, I want to be honest about that, because this is a real story and real stories have real moments, and there were some looks that were not generous and there were some whispers that I caught pieces of, and there was one specific moment when a guy I barely knew walked past and said something under his breath that I am not going to repeat, and Danny started to turn around and I put my hand on his arm and I said, "Leave it," and he looked at me and I said, "It is not worth it," and he nodded and we kept moving and I kept my head up and I kept moving. And here is the thing about keeping your head up: when you would rather disappear, it gets easier every single second that you do not disappear. Every second you stay present and visible and real is a second that you earn back from every version of yourself that hid. Every moment you chose to stay was a tiny revolution. The night moved forward and the music played and Danny and I danced, and it was completely ridiculous and wonderful, and at some point in the night someone asked if they could take a photo of us and we said yes, and they posted it, and by the next morning it had been shared more times than I could count, with comments from people I had never met saying things that made me have to put my phone down and breathe. But the moment I want to end with the moment that I think about more than any other moment from that night happened near the end of the evening. I was standing near the edge of the dance floor just watching everything, and a sophomore came up to me who I had never spoken to before, and he was clearly nervous, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Of course," and he said, "How did you get the courage to do this?" And he said it so quietly, like the words were fragile, and I looked at him and I saw myself 2 years ago standing in the dark being terrified of my own reflection, and I said the courage came from one person who saw me before I could see myself, and I said, "Do you have someone like that?" And he thought about it and said, "Maybe," and I said, "Then hold on to them." I got home that night and I sat in my room still in the dress, and I thought about the 11-year-old kid who first felt that pull towards something he did not have words for, and I thought about all the years of hiding and all the fear and all the nights staring at ceilings, and I thought about Maya and my mom and Danny and Sophia, and even the sophomore who came up to me with his fragile question, and I thought about the look in that dressing room mirror when the dress went on for the first time. And I felt something settle in me, something that had been spinning and spinning finally finding its center. I do not have a tidy conclusion for you because life does not work that way. There are still days that are hard, there are still questions I am working through, there are still moments where the world feels like it was not quite built with me in mind, but there is something I know now that I did not know before prom night, and it is this: the parts of you that you have been hiding the longest are usually the parts that are most purely and completely you, and the moment you let someone see those parts for the first time, even if it is terrifying, even if your hands are shaking, even if you are wearing a midnight blue vintage gown walking through a gym in front of your entire school, the world does not end, and in fact something extraordinary happens. You begin. And if you are out there right now hiding something about yourself that feels too heavy to carry alone, I want you to hear this the way Danny's voice sounded when he said, "I have got you." I want you to hear it the way Maya laughed when she said, "We are finding you a dress." I want you to hear it the way my mom said, "I love you exactly as you are." And I want you to know that somewhere out there is a midnight blue dress and a best friend and a dressing room mirror and a moment that is waiting for you. And when it comes, I hope you are brave enough to walk through the doors and keep your head up, because you are worth being seen. Every single part of you is worth being seen.